But that thing is very heavy and hard to lift and carry around. So we had that set up in our house. So when we had the sessions, they were done on this huge portable tape recorder. And the people on the base, a lot of them knew what we were doing, and they became interested in it. Now, they didn't know who the woman was, and we protected her identity because this was so strange. We didn't want to affect her or affect her husband as a naval personnel. So we didn't tell anyone who the woman was. But when they began to find out what we were doing, they would come to our house once a week and say, well, what's the latest chapter? And we would play it for them. And everybody was just astounded and fascinated. It was like this was so totally new to everybody. And so they knew what we were doing. Then a disaster hit that changed our lives forever about this time. Now, like I said, my husband had just come back from Vietnam and was on his way to work one night to the base, and he was almost killed in a horrible car accident where he was hit head-on the highway going to the base by a drunken officer, a Navy officer. He had been drinking at the O Club on the base and was on his way home. And he went over the line, and we had a head-on collision with my husband. My husband ended up being pinned into the wreckage. He was driving a Volkswagen bus, and he was just ground into the wreckage because there's no motor in the front of those cars. And the only thing that saved his life that night was because there was the car behind him, there was a Navy corpsman who had just returned from Vietnam. And this black man knew all about the emergency treatments for trauma because he had been over there. If he hadn't have been on the scene, Johnny might have died right there. But he was able to save his life until the helicopters could come from the base to try to help. They had the fire trucks there, and they had to try to get him out of that wreckage. As it was, he lost all of the blood in his body, but they managed to get into the base, and they had to put him on O blood because of the universal donor, because he needed to have all the blood in his body completely replaced. But he ended up being crushed into the wreckage. And he spent a month in intensive care, in and out of consciousness. Most of the time he didn't even know where he was. He had some brain concussions, and his face had also been torn up. So it was a horrible accident. But that night, they came and got me, and I went to the hospital, and the 5 different doctors came out, one after the other, was telling me different reasons why there was no way he could possibly live through the night, that it was just too severe, too much trauma. But I knew differently, because when I was working with this woman, we were experimenting. We didn't know what you could do and what you couldn't do because we'd never had any experience with it. There was nothing to tell us what you couldn't do. Part of our experimentation, we took her into the future to see what we were going to be doing in the future. Well, she saw us living in the country, very much like where we live now, up in the country, and she saw us with grandchildren, which we didn't have at that time. We had a big family, but none of them were married yet. She saw us living in the country with grandchildren. Well, that night, when he was telling us this, the different doctors were saying all the different things that could kill my husband during the night, I couldn't believe it, because I knew we had stumbled onto something that was so big and important that I had to believe it, even though it was strange. If I had to believe it, I had to believe it all. And part of what we were told was the way God really was and how he was love. And I just knew that he was not going to die that night. How could he die if she saw him in the future? So as each one of them was telling me what was going to happen, I told them, no, he's not. He's going to be all right. Finally, they just shook their heads and they said, well, if you believe in it that much, maybe it'll happen. Maybe it'll be all right. So Johnny was in intensive care for a month, in and out of consciousness. Then after that, he was in a body cast for 8 months. So most of the year he spent in the hospital in a body cast where he couldn't move. And I can't even imagine how awful that would have to be to not be able to move. But they kept calling him the Miracle Man because they said there was no way he could have gotten through all of this. But the important part of all of this that I usually like people to know is that because the people on the base knew what we were doing, they kept saying, this was our punishment. This was God punishing us. We were doing something we weren't supposed to be doing. We were peering around corners into the unknown and the hidden. Reincarnation, for goodness sakes, work of the devil. And so this was God's way of punishing us. Of course, I could only shake my head at their ignorance, but I could not believe that. I knew God wouldn't punish us. He wouldn't want to punish us for just asking questions and wanting to find answers. That just wasn't the way the God that I knew would work. So I couldn't believe that what was happening to us, horrible as it was punishment by any creator being. So it ended up then, after a year in the hospital, he was put out of the Navy as a disabled veteran. We had to go somewhere. So we moved into the country, into the hills of Arkansas. We had a big family. We had to go somewhere where you could live on little money and a place where we could be out in the country where we could grow things. That was our desire anyway. But he was put out of the Navy and we moved to Arkansas. And here he spent 25 years in a wheelchair. He could get outside with crutches and he could drive a hand-controlled car, but the rest of his life was disabled by living in the wheelchair. Of course, he rebuilt his life. He became the Veteran Service Officer for the county. He was very active in ham radio. So he built a life of his own. But our whole world was totally turned upside down at that time. Now I'm glad that we live in the country because I travel all over the world and I'm in these energies with the cities and all of the people of the traffic. I don't like that anymore. I like to get back here where I can recharge my batteries by being out in the country, away from those discordant energies. I can rebuild myself and recharge my batteries. So it turned out to be a very perfect place to live. But in the beginning, we didn't know that. We just moved here because it was going to be a cheap way to live without having to spend a lot of money. But all of my work with the hypnosis and traveling back into the past, it had done something to me. It had planted something there that I would never forget, that I wanted to know more. The story of all of this, about my beginnings, is told in the very first book that I ever wrote. The book is called 5 Lives Remembered. And that book has never been published. Now, I don't know if it ever will be, because the things I've discovered since then have been so powerful and different and unique that I don't know if that one needs to be published or not. But it was the stories of our beginning, and it is mentioned in several of my other books. And when I lecture now at writers' conferences, people say, they're there because they have written one book and they want to know what to do with it. I tell them writing one book is the answer, because often that one book may not be the one that's published. That sometimes a publisher will like your style of writing, but then he'll say, do you have anything else? And if all you have is just one book, what are you going to do? Tell them that's all you have. So with me, anyway, the first book was never published, and even though I tried, I sent it out many places, thought it was unique, but my life went on into many more adventures, and now it seems kind of simple and ordinary, what we found. But that's the way the life has taken a turn anyway. All right, but that was that first book. But during that time, I had to forget all about hypnosis. I had to forget about reincarnation and all of these adventures because I had to rebuild my life. Everything was completely turned upside down. I had to have been given the responsibility of the family because my husband went into a very black depression where he didn't want anything to do with anyone. And he really cut out a lot of his family as he went inward. His life was over. He thought his career was over. Everything had changed too much. It took him many years to come to terms with all of this and to readjust. But during that time, I was busy taking care of him and raising my family. So all of the thoughts about the adventures and the hypnosis had to go on the back burner while I did all of this. Living in the country, trying to raise a garden. Now I say it's like living. I've lived many lives in this one life because I've taken so many twists and turns along the way. Everybody's life can do that. When I'm at lectures now, some people tell me, my life is over. My children are grown. They're out of the house. My life is over. And I said, no, it's not. Your life could take a 180-degree turn, go off in a totally new direction, off into something you would never have even imagined. And you don't know what your life's going to be. You have to be open to adventure, to anything. And it could be totally different, and that was what happened to me. The life went off in a totally different direction than I could have ever imagined. But it was about 10 years, anyway, before I was able to really get back into this. That happened when all of my kids were beginning to leave home. They were getting married. They were going off to college. It's what you call the empty nest syndrome.